All right, so today we're going deep, really deep, into a sensitive and complex topic.
Buckle up, folks.
Yeah, we're talking about the treatment of minorities in Bangladesh.
Specifically, Hindus, Buddhists, and tribal communities.
Exactly. And we're basing this whole deep dive on a UN document, pretty hefty one too,
Oh, yeah.
submitted by, well, get ready for the name, the Human Rights Congress for Bangladesh Minorities.
You can just say HRCBM.
Right, HRCBM, much easier. Anyway, this report, it's not exactly a pat on the back for Bangladesh, you know?
Little close.
They're alleging get this, a genocidal crime.
Whoa, that's a strong term.
Yeah, and they're claiming it's been going on for decades, this pattern of violence and discrimination, really disturbing stuff.
And what's really interesting is how the document digs into the history, like way back to 1946, trying to trace the roots of the tension.
Yeah, they go way back, and they don't hold back either. They even call out the current ruling party, the Awami League.
Oh, really?
Yeah, saying they're involved in land seizures, taking land from Hindu families. It's pretty serious stuff. We're talking allegations of massacres. They even used the phrase systematic campaign of rape during the 1971 war.
That's heavy.
And there's even a recent incident just a few years ago where they claim 600 women were sexually assaulted in one town.
It's important to remember, though, that using a term like genocidal crime that has a very specific legal meaning.
Okay, like what?
Like, it implies intent to destroy, at least in part, a whole group, national, ethnic, racial, or religious group.
So it's not just violence. It's violence with a specific goal in mind.
Exactly, and it requires a very high burden of proof.
So this is more than just a report. It's almost like an accusation, a legal indictment or something.
It's definitely a serious charge.
So where do we even start with all of this? This is a lot to unpack.
Well, I think we need to understand the historical context. HRCBM points to the 1946 Noakhali Riots, a major turning point.
Great. Noakhali Riots. Refresh my memory. What was that all about?
So these riots, they targeted Hindus, right, in what was then East Bengal, really set a precedent for the violence to come.
Okay, but back up a second. For those of us who aren't history buffs, what was happening back then in that region?
Oh, right, good point. It's easy to forget that context. See, India was about to get its independence from the British.
Gotcha.
And tensions were high between Hindus and Muslims, really high. These riots, the Noakhali riots, with all that violence and people being forced from their homes, it was like a preview of the conflicts that would tear the region apart later on.
So these riots weren't just some random thing. They were a symptom of deeper issues.
Exactly. And then just a year later, bam, 1947, India and Pakistan get partitioned.
Oh, yeah, the big split.
East Bengal becomes East Pakistan, mostly Muslim, while West Bengal stays with India, mostly Hindu. But this partition, it didn't solve anything. It just created a whole new set of problems.
Yeah, like what?
Well, millions of people were displaced, forced to move across these new borders. It was chaos.
And in the midst of all this, the HRCBM claims the violence against Hindus just kept going all through the 50s and 60s in East Pakistan.
Yeah, they argue that Hindu rights were slowly eroded during that time. More discrimination, intimidation, and violence becoming more and more common.
It's like a slow burn leading up to something bigger.
Right, all this simmering tension. It finally boiled over in 1971 with the Bangladesh Liberation War.
Yes, the war. I know Bangladesh became its own country then, but the HRCBM report, it doesn't sugarcoat anything. They use some strong language to describe what happened.
Yeah, it was a brutal conflict.
Like what?
They talk about a systematic campaign of rape, mostly targeting Hindu women.
That's just awful.
The 1971 war, it was brutal. And the HRCBM report, they don't hold back. They detail all the atrocities, especially against the Hindus.
I bet.
And the numbers they cite, they're just staggering. 3 million people killed, they say, and 400,000 women raped.
It's hard to even imagine.
And they place the blame squarely on the Pakistani army and these Islamist militias.
Doing what?
That they carried out a deliberate campaign of terror.
It's just the scale of the suffering, it's hard to even grasp.
It really is. And what's even more disturbing is the allegation that these crimes have gone largely unpunished.
You mean no one was held accountable?
That's what they're saying. And this lack of accountability, they argue, it's created a culture of impunity that continues to this day.
It's like a wound that never healed.
Exactly. And to add insult to injury, after the war, you had this whole thing with the Vested Property Act.
Yeah, that sounds like something out of a dystopian novel.
It's a bit chilling, isn't it? So the HRCBM explains that this law, it actually started in Pakistan, but basically it allowed the government to take property from Hindus who they labeled as enemies of the state.
So even after fighting for their own country, Hindus were still being stripped of their land.
That's what the HRCBM claims. And it wasn't just a few isolated incidents. They argue that this law was systematically used to dispossess Hindu families on a large scale.
Like,
Their land was transferred to the state or to people with political connections.
that's just wrong.
It's a very contentious issue. And it gets worse. They claim that a 2001 attempt to fix this, they called it the Vested Property Return Act.
Sounds promising.
It was supposed to be, but the HRCBM argues that it was largely ineffective.
Like how?
It was full of bureaucratic obstacles that made it almost impossible for Hindu families to get their stolen land back.
So they made a law to take the land and then made it nearly impossible to get it back.
That's the argument. And they even go so far as to directly accuse the ruling Awami League of profiting from this whole thing.
Really?
Yeah, they point to their 2008 lawsuit challenging the law, claiming it was basically a tool for the powerful to grab land.
So we've got this history of tension, a brutal war, and then this law that seems designed to take advantage of an entire community. This is some heady stuff.
It is, and it's just the beginning.
Where do we even go from here?
Well, the HRCBM's report doesn't stop there. They go on to detail a whole series of violent incidents and displacement. It's a pretty stark picture of what minorities in Bangladesh have been going through.
Okay, well then let's get into it. This is a deep dive after all. All right, so we're picking back up on this deep dive with, well, kind of a heavy heart, right? I mean, we've seen how much Bangladesh has gone through, especially the Hindu population. It's like
It's tough.
every time there's some big event, they seem to face the worst of it.
Yeah, that's one of the main things the HRCBM report is trying to show. This isn't just something new. It's been happening again and again.
A pattern.
Yeah, a pattern. They point to some specific incidents, especially in the 90s and 2000s, that really make this clear.
Like that violence back in 1990, it was all over the country, right? The report even mentions Taslima Nasrin's book, Laja.
Oh, yeah, Laja. That was,
I remember it causing a lot of controversy back then, but I don't remember the details.
well, Laja means shame in Bengali, and the book, it tells the story of a Hindu family during that time, all the persecution they faced.
Right.
It's a novel, fiction, but a lot of people saw it as reflecting what was really happening, the fears and anxieties of the Hindu community.
And that was just a few years after Islam was declared the state religion, wasn't it?
It was in 1988.
Right, so Bangladesh has always had a Muslim majority, but making Islam the state religion, that must have had a big impact.
It did. It changed things politically and socially. Some say it emboldened extremist groups, made things more dangerous for religious minorities.
And then just a few years later, in 2001, the HRCBM says there was another wave of violence against Hindus, this time because the Awami League lost the election.
Right, that's a serious accusation.
It's like they're saying the losing party was behind it, trying to cause chaos and destabilize the new government.
That's the claim. And it's worth noting that Amnesty International also documented a lot of human rights abuses during that period.
So the HRCBM isn't the only one saying this.
No, it adds weight to their claims.
It's like these minorities are caught in the middle of a power struggle, pawns in a bigger game.
It creates this sense of vulnerability, like no matter who's in charge, they're never truly safe.
And then there's the Noakhali massacre in 2003. That one still gives me chills. 11 members of a Hindu family, women and children, burned alive.
That was horrific, truly barbaric.
Hard to even think about.
And what's even more disturbing is that the trial for that case, it went on for 18 years.
18 years.
Yeah, it did just wrapped up recently. It shows how slow the wheels of justice turn when it comes to crimes against minorities.
It's like the system failed to protect them completely.
And you have to wonder, how many people have just given up hope of seeing justice done?
Especially with this Vested Property Act still hanging over their heads. It's not just about land, it's about feeling secure, belonging somewhere, having a future.
Exactly. The HRCBM argues that this law, it creates this constant fear and uncertainty for the Hindu community. Even if they haven't had their land taken, it's always a possibility.
Like a sword hanging over them.
Yeah, it makes them feel like outsiders in their own country.
And remember how they said that Vested Property Return Act from 2001? It was basically useless.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a solution, a chance for families to get back what was taken.
Fresh start.
But the HRCBM says it was full of red tape, a lack of transparency, made it almost impossible to actually get their land back.
It's like they were set up to fail.
And they claim that in many cases, the people who took the land in the first place were the ones in charge of giving it back.
Okay.
So the whole thing was rigged against them from the start.
That's messed up. And then there was that Supreme Court case in 2006. The HRCBM filed a writ, right?
They did. It was a big deal.
Remind me what that was all about.
So they presented evidence of over 15,000 violent incidents against minorities just since those 2001 elections.
Wow.
We're talking killings, rapes, land grabs, forced conversions. It was a scathing indictment of the government's failure to protect its citizens.
And what happened?
The court actually sided with them, ordered the government to take action, address the issue.
So they won. They had the law on their side. You'd think that would change things.
You would, but according to the HRCBM, the government pretty much ignored the court's order.
Seriously?
Yeah, the violence continued. The cycle of impunity just kept going.
That's demoralizing. You fight for justice, you win, and then nothing changes.
It shows how deep the problem goes. And then, of course, there were the 2021 attacks that really put this issue in the international spotlight.
Those were just awful, those attacks. And it all started with those rumors about the Quran, right?
Yeah. A rumor spread on social media claiming a Hindu man desecrated the Quran.
And it turned out to be false.
Completely false, but it sparked outrage, and it quickly turned into mob violence against Hindu communities across the country.
It's crazy how fast misinformation can spread and cause real harm.
It's terrifying, and in this case, the consequences were devastating. The HRCBM's findings were shocking: hundreds of homes and temples destroyed, 15 Hindu men killed, and the worst part, they alleged that 600 women were sexually assaulted in just one town, Hajiganj.
600, it's just, I can't even.
It's unfathomable, and it was all based on a lie.
Makes it even more tragic. And what's really concerning is that the HRCBM accuses the government of trying to cover it up.
They say that instead of condemning the violence and going after the perpetrators, the government tried to delay a judicial inquiry.
Why would they do that?
The HRCBM suggests they were trying to protect their image, downplay the violence to avoid international criticism.
But wouldn't that just make people trust them even less?
You'd think so, and this whole thing about not holding people accountable, it's not just the 2021 attacks. The HRCBM also points to the Sahabuddin Commission report that was supposed to investigate the 2001 violence.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
The report was very critical of the government, but the HRCBM claims it was suppressed. They never really acknowledged it or acted on its findings.
So it's like a pattern. They deny and ignore these awful events instead of dealing with them.
That's the impression the HRCBM report gives, and they highlight this really shocking statistic. Over 20,000 cases of violence against minorities are still pending in the Bangladeshi legal system.
20,000, wow, that's a lot of justice delayed.
And potentially denied. And on top of that, they allege that the government has used blasphemy charges to silence people who speak out against this injustice.
So people are afraid to even report crimes or ask for help.
It creates this climate of fear on top of this huge backlog of cases and a government that doesn't seem to care, or at least can't do anything about it.
It's a pretty bleak picture. Where do we even go from here?
Well, it's important to remember that the HRCBM report, it's just one perspective, even though it's detailed and disturbing.
Right, it's one side of the story.
We need to look at other viewpoints, understand all the complexities, and think about possible solutions.
Okay, so how about we do that? When we come back for part 3, we can explore those complexities and try to figure out a path forward. So here we are, part 3. And honestly, after the last 2 parts, I'm feeling a bit, I don't know, heavy.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, the HRCBM's report, it's really intense. It paints this picture of the situation for minorities in Bangladesh that's just, well, grim, to be honest.
It's understandable to feel that way.
It's hard not to feel overwhelmed, even hopeless, when you see these problems that just seem to go on and on.
I get it, but I think it's dangerous to just give up, to say it's too complicated or there's nothing we can do.
I agree. Giving up shouldn't be an option, but where do we even start? We've got history, discriminatory laws, social prejudices, and a justice system that doesn't seem to work.
It's a lot, but I do believe there are things we can do, both within Bangladesh and internationally, to create a more just society.
Okay, so like what are the actual steps?
Well, the first step is acknowledging the problem, and the HRCBM has done that with this report. They've brought it to light.
So awareness is there, but that doesn't automatically fix anything. What are the concrete actions that could make a real difference?
Well, tackling the legal framework is crucial. The HRCBM, they've been calling for changes to the Vested Property Act. They say it's a major source of discrimination against Hindu families.
It's been a problem for so long, but is there any real chance they'll change a law that's been around for so long?
It's tough. No doubt there are people in power who benefit from the way things are now. But there are also a lot of people in Bangladesh who want reform.
Really?
Human rights groups, legal experts, even some politicians, They all see that something needs to change.
So there's hope that pressure from within Bangladesh could lead to real legal progress.
I think so. And it's not just about changing the laws, it's also about making sure the existing laws are applied fairly. Remember how the HRCBM said that the 2001 Act, the one that was supposed to return property, it was basically useless?
Yeah, like giving people false hope.
Exactly. Any real reform would need to make the process clear, create transparent records, and hold those who took the land accountable.
Makes sense. So legal reforms are important, but I'm guessing it goes deeper than that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you can't just change a law and expect all this social and religious prejudices to just vanish.
You're right, laws provide a structure, but they can't change people's hearts and minds. That's where education comes in.
Education. But how do you tackle something as ingrained as religious intolerance? It's not like there's a simple solution.
It's a long process, for sure, but it starts with dialogue, getting people from different faiths to talk to each other, to understand each other.
Like building bridges.
Exactly. Building bridges, promoting empathy, challenging those narratives of hate and division that come from extremist groups and sometimes even religious schools.
So creating spaces where people can connect, see each other as human beings.
Exactly. And it's about teaching young people to think critically, to question stereotypes, to see the dangers of prejudice.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's not just about attitudes, it's also about economics, right? The inequalities that can fuel these tensions.
Absolutely. When people are struggling to survive, they're more likely to be manipulated, to fall prey to those who want to exploit their fears.
So helping people economically can also help prevent conflict.
It's all connected. Investing in education, creating jobs, providing social safety nets, these things can create a more stable and fair society.
Okay, so we've got legal reforms, education, and economic empowerment. That's a pretty good plan. But I'm guessing it takes more than just good intentions to make it happen.
It does. It takes commitment from the Bangladeshi government, from civil society, and from the international community.
So what about the international community? I mean, Bangladesh is its own country. Other countries can't just tell them what to do.
Of course not, but they can use their influence to promote human rights, encourage dialogue, and hold the government accountable.
Like using diplomatic pressure, sanctions, or supporting human rights groups working in Bangladesh?
Exactly. And it's not just about governments. Individuals can make a difference too.
Like how?
We can support organizations like the HRCBM, raise awareness, speak out against injustice.
So it's not just a them problem, it's a we problem. We're all connected.
That's right. And it's not just about abstract principles. It's about real people whose lives have been affected by this violence and discrimination.
Yeah, behind all the statistics and reports, there are human stories, stories of suffering, but also resilience and hope.
And those stories need to be heard.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to go back to something the HRCBM report mentioned, the issue of religious conversion.
Ah, yes, that's a sensitive topic.
It is. There are concerns that Hindus are being pressured to convert to Islam, sometimes through violence, sometimes through more subtle pressures.
And there's this fear that the Hindu population is shrinking, that they might eventually disappear from Bangladesh altogether.
It's a complex issue. We need to be careful and respectful of everyone's beliefs.
Absolutely, but it's also something we can't ignore. We need to protect religious freedom for all citizens of Bangladesh.
But people should be free to choose their faith, or no faith, without fear.
Exactly, and people should be judged on who they are, not what they believe.
Well, I think we've covered a lot today. The history, the challenges, the potential solutions. It's been a lot to process.
It has, but hopefully it's been eye-opening too.
It definitely has. So for our listeners, what's the one thing you want them to take away from all of this?
Don't turn away. Don't let the distance or the complexity make you feel powerless. Stay informed, stay engaged, and use your voice to make the world a better place.
That's a great message. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope it's made you think and maybe even inspired you to learn more and take action